call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 100 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, March 7, 2023, the committee meets to discuss a study on the high-frequency rail projects. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Commons standing orders, and therefore members can attend in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Equipped with a very powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We're therefore asking all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Members of the committee appearing before us today as witnesses for the first part from 11 to noon. We have from Civity Management Consultants joining us from Germany. We have Mr. Friedman Brockmeyer. Wie geht's in dir? Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Et de la Chambre de commerce et l'industrie de Québec, nous avons Monsieur Steve.
So we have Mr. Steve Lavoie, who is the President of the Chambre de commerce et d'industrie de Québec. Welcome to you. So we're going to start with opening remarks, and you have the floor, Mr. Lavoie. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Dear committee members, thank you for welcoming me here today. First of all, a few words about the organisation I represent. The Chambre de commerce et d'industrie de Québec, the CCIQ, has nearly 4,200 members. Our role is to raise awareness, mobilise and act to promote the economic development of our members and the community. The Chambre de commerce et d'industrie de Québec is Eastern Quebec's largest business association, and today I serve as their voice. Dear committee members, I'm here to tell you that the people of Quebec City have been waiting for a long time. There are over 1 million of us in the Greater Region for a long time, been waiting for a rail connection worthy of this name between the Quebec metropolis, the federal capital, and the metropolis in Ontario. We want a fast connection that is frequent and reliable. This is particularly true for business people. In fact, this link is vital, essential to the development of Quebec's national capital region. Why? Because Quebec City, our national capital, is isolated, cut off from other large urban centres in an age of interconnectivity. This is a major drawback for its economy and people's mobility. Quebec City, the provincial capital, is home to the National Assembly, Université Laval, and many other post-secondary institutions, as well as a world-class technology park, a booming manufacturing and insurance sector, and much more. Not to mention our expertise in video game development and a thriving tourism industry. Thus, Quebec City is a high-potential region with talented business people. However, to fully realise its potential, Quebec City can't live in autarky and self-sufficiency. Our business people, like the population in general, need transportation infrastructure towards other highly esteemed centres. We need a solid, reliable 21st century infrastructure that will enable them to do business. To date, there are 33 departures from Quebec City per week, more or less 7 per day to Montreal, and there are no evening departures. Supply remains limited. And while we usually know what time the train will leave, we never know when it will actually arrive, because there are no dedicated tracks. This uncertainty makes it extremely difficult for business people to plan meetings and limits our ability to actually do business. Regular delays make it difficult, well nigh impossible indeed, to choose the train as the preferred means of travel between Quebec City and Montreal, and so it's the car that wins. This has to change. Quebecers need a reliable, efficient service. They need a high-frequency train and a fast train. In this respect, it is clear that the Quebec-Montreal section must be a high-speed one. Indeed, we're all in favour of a high-frequency train, but the issue of speed must not be overlooked. It currently takes an average of 3 hours and 10 minutes That's when the Via Rail train isn't delayed, to cover the distance between Quebec City Station and the downtown Montreal train station. We need to considerably reduce travel time. It's the only way to change the habits of all those who currently take their car because they say it's more convenient. Studies, including one carried out by the SNCF, the French National Railway Company, conclude that smaller metropolitan areas benefit more from high-speed rail as they are then connected to larger cities with bigger populations. So for a city like Quebec City, a high-speed rail would have a great impact on its economy. Improving service would of course, not only bring consumers, including tourists, closer together, it would also help attract and retain workers in all sectors of activity. In a context of full employment in the Quebec City region, improving access would make job opportunities more attractive. This project will make a major contribution to the recruitment of top talent from all sectors, particularly in the academic, scientific and cultural field. A frequent high-speed train is also an invaluable asset for maintaining and attracting head offices to Quebec City, which generates significant economic spin-offs. The train not only attracts and brings people here, it also opens a window onto large urban centres in the business world. As we all know, when it comes to transport, demand depends on supply. The better the supply, the busier the corridor will be. This project has to come to fruition. We have to be rigorous yet ambitious. A lack of vision and a lack of action would have an impact for decades to come. It's time to act. The time has come to strengthen the links between Quebec City, Montreal and Toronto with a high-speed, frequent and reliable connection. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lavoie.
Mr. Brockmeyer, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure, dear members of Transport Committee of the Canadian Parliament. Let me introduce me first. My name is Friedemann Brockmeyer. I'm a director of Civility Management Consultants. Civility is a street management boutique from Berlin, Germany, and we are entirely focused on the mobility and infrastructure sector. So we are working with all the clients from the rail and public transport ecosystem in Europe. That means infrastructure managers, ministries, railway undertakings, industrial players, construction companies, and all the important actors. I personally have a very long track record for more than a decade in analyzing high-speed projects and new build projects, especially regarding capex and total cost of ownership. So we've worked for several infrastructure managers in Europe, smaller ones like Banenor, but also in Norway, but also larger ones like Network Rail, Deutsche Bahn, SBB, ÖBB. And we have a lot of experience from several projects in Europe, so I cannot share any experience from Asia. That's, I think, it's always worth to look into. But I can today share with you some highlight findings, lessons learned from the European perspective on this. And first of all, I think it's a great chance for Canada to think about rail, because Canada is a very large country, but you are still very fortunate that a large share of your population lives in a very small corridor from Quebec to Windsor. It's always good if you have a lot of people in the same area if you want to connect them by rail. And in the end, we have to compare all these solutions by rail with other modes of transport, and you have always to be very sure that it's the best solution for transport and connecting these urban centers. What I can share and what's the experience from Europe is that there are, let's say, two different kind of high-speed rail systems. One is more the, let's say, the French style. It's a little black wild, connecting Paris to the rest of the country with long stretches, very high speed. You can find the same in Spain, for example, connecting Madrid, the capital, with other cities, more with longer distances. Then we have other complex systems. If you're looking to Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, where we more have intercity services like metro-like services. That means where we have a dense populated area and where we are connecting major urban population centers directly with a linear line layout. That means if you have all the cities at let's say it's a string of pearls, for example, if you're looking into the whole corridor coming down from Amsterdam via Brussels, Cologne, Frankfurt, Stuttgart to Munich, to Vienna, this is a very long line where we have one, or maybe we have in the future one service, for example. That's a different approach, and that's the first lesson I would like to share with you. That if so far as what I have learned from the Canadian plans, that it would be really advantageous to think about a linear line layout, so connecting directly Toronto via Ottawa to Montreal and Quebec. So don't have these direct connections, have a linear line layout so that all the cities are at the same string of pearls. I think, and then have a very high frequency, 30 or 60 minutes. That's really it. The second point is really to think about speed. As far as I know, you're calling this project high frequency rail because you're not planning with very high speed or high speed, let's say, up from a level above 200 kilometers per hour. High speed is a very useful instrument if the topography is easy. Yeah, and as far as I know, and I'm looking into your maps, you have a very flat terrain in the corridor. And if you have a flat terrain, that means you don't have to build a lot of viaducts and tunnels. If you have to build a lot of viaducts and tunnels, then it becomes very easily very expensive to build high-speed rail. If you're looking into your terrain, then I would assume it's not that complicated to build high-speed rail to, let's say, to a very reasonable price and to improve the overall effectiveness of your commercial operations. Another point is really to look into, and that's also something we have learned bitterly in Europe, is to looking into the capacity constraints. Often you build high-speed rail from the outskirts to the outskirts, and you still use the legacy network in the metropolitan areas. These city stretches, these urban stretches, they are defining the capacity of your speed or of your high-speed rail or high-frequency rail network. That means if you want to have a successful business case and want to have really a mode shift in the corridor, then you have really addressed and you have to think about how we can use innovative methods like longer platforms, bi-level trains to increase the capacity and foster the overall economic benefits of the system. And the last one is also something that's really important. We are often looking into these projects from a CapEx perspective, from a speed perspective. But in the end, it's all about customer satisfaction. And what does it mean, customer satisfaction? Customer satisfaction means that you have a reliable service which is on time and frequent intervals. That means we need a long-term planning. First of all, you should start from the timetable. Which timetable we want to offer, which journey times we want to offer, and then if you have this timetable, when to start, which infrastructure, which rolling stock we need, which speed we need to be competitive against other modes of transport, but also to be competitive against the existing system. So where are the advantages? And
Mr. Brockmeyer, thank you.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time for opening remarks. It's very interesting, and I know that colleagues are going to want to dive into technical questions with you because you do bring a lot of expertise to the table. Before we start the questioning, I just want to let our members know that unfortunately we have lost one of our witnesses temporarily. We're trying to get him back on. Monsieur Lavoie, malheureusement, n'est plus là. On va essayer de lui...
Unfortunately, we've lost Mr. Lavoie. We'll try and contact him by telephone. We've had some issues with his connection.
And the only witness we'll be able to question for the moment is Mr. Brockmeyer. And I guess I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Strahl, for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Well, my question is for Mr. Brockmeyer. I listened to your remarks, appreciate them. we're talking here. There's a bit of a debate in our country. I'm sure that you might have seen it as you prepared your remarks between high frequency rail and high speed rail. You spoke of high speed rail and the need for a flat terrain, etc. Do you have any comments specifically about the high frequency rail, which is on dedicated tracks but perhaps doesn't have the top end speed of high speed rail versus a pure high speed rail system? Are there examples in Europe of where that has worked well, or do you have an opinion of the value of one versus the other in terms of ridership, in terms of, you said this can be done at a, quote, very reasonable price. If the terrain is right, we've heard we're talking about the billions of dollars here in terms of a very reasonable price, and have heard perhaps double to go from high frequency rail to high speed rail. But I'd like you to, if you can, address the difference between the two, and if there's what the very reasonable price can both be built for a very reasonable price in your view, and what does that actually constitute?
Yeah. So both can be built for a reasonable price. It really depends on the topography. So what's the problem? To make a long story short, it's the curve ruddy. If you want to drive a train with very high speed, you cannot have this very close curve ruddy. So if you're in a more hilly area or mountainous area, you have to build a lot of tunnels and bridges. Yeah. So that's really driving the prices for building high-speed rail. But if you're on a flat terrain, then it's much easier because there are no mountains and you can build the curves as you want to. The problem is, and that's maybe something, you have a lot of urban area. You need all this urban enabling, so have space in the cities and all this stuff. But it's more suburban as far as I know. So I don't think it's a big issue. So what's the cost driver for high-speed rail? To make it very short, is how many tunnels and how many bridges I need, and how we have started in Europe. We have started with the easy stretches. So the French started in the 70s to build very cheap high-speed rail lines between Paris and Lyon. The Spanish have done the same. The Germans have started a little different. But what's remaining in Europe today, and that's the reason why it's so impressive expensive today. Right now, we are building high-speed rail lines which are more like undergrounds. For example, in Germany we have a new high-speed line between Stuttgart and Munich, and this is almost completely in tunnels. And there's another factor which you may also know from Canada, and this is something crazy stuff from the UK, where you have a lot of this urban enabling. That's something you have also you have to deep dive into. Where are the reasons and what's the lessons learned from the UK? As far as I know, it's more about the complexity of a project organization. Okay. But it's not driven by high-speed rail. That's very important.
Okay, I'll ask you the question I was going to ask to Mr. Lavoie, and perhaps you have some experience as well as a consultant on these issues. The price for we've been told that the high-speed rail, high-frequency rail is designed to compete with airlines between big cities. So between Quebec and Montreal, the cost per passenger, I just looked, is about, if you book in advance, $450 return. The cost on the slow-moving train is about $175 return. What has been the experience in Europe? What is the price? What price point are passengers willing to pay? What price premium are they willing to pay to go up from kind of the slow train to the high frequency or high speed train? Is there a point of diminishing returns if the fares get too high? Do passenger loads reduce? And what is the rate? What is the experience in I don't know if you have some examples of the level of subsidy that's provided per passenger in the markets that you are familiar with.
Okay. Both questions are not very easy to address. So first of all, for the question of the farebox revenues, we have very sophisticated yield management systems in place for all high-speed operators in Europe. But you can say the markup for high-speed rail is between 50 and 100% on slow trains. It really depends because it's a very sophisticated yield and revenue management system. It's not that easy, but there is. And that really depends again on the travel time advantages. So if you have travel time between two major centers, which is below 4 hours, then you are highly competitive because then it makes no sense to go to the airport and take a plane. Yeah? Then you have a lot of willingness to pay by the customers. So the second question around the subsidies is all the high-speed train services in Europe are commercial. The reason for that is that we have a different organization in the rail industry. We have independent infrastructure managers, and then we have open access operators on the infrastructure, which are operating commercially. That means all the subsidies are in the infrastructure. It's not that easy to calculate the subsidies, but you can say they are, or it's, I have to recalculate, but it should be definitely below 10 Canadian dollars per passenger, let's say so. Very roughly, very roughly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brockmeyer, and thank you, Mr. Strahl. Next, we have Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 6 minutes for your questioning, please.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Brockmeyer, thanks for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is you mentioned something about Britain's urban enabling, and it made me think about how in Canada it's quite complex to do projects that require cooperation and involvement at the national level, the regional or provincial level, and the local level, because there's different powers invested in each level. How is that dealt with in Europe, and do you think it's similar to Canada's challenges?
So to be very honest, I don't know the challenges in Canada very well, but what I can say from Europe is it really depends. In most of the countries, building rail is really the job of a national level. So in some countries like France, it's highly centralized. In other countries like Germany, for example, these are federal states, as Canada is as well. But you have to organize. You have to organize municipalities, states, and the federal level, but it's manageable. I think this is not the issue. In the UK, it's completely different. The problem in the UK is, that's my opinion, they have not spent enough time on building up the capacity to build rail, because they haven't built railways for more than 70 years in the UK. So they have no experience in building new lines, with very, very few exceptions. In all other countries, we have a lot of experience. So they have to buy all the knowledge from outside of the UK, and they've used a lot of domestic consultants for that as well, and that is really increasing the cost. So we have worked for high-speed 2, and we were never able to understand why are they so expensive. They are in all asset categories.
Okay, excuse me for interrupting.
Yeah,
I have a couple more questions, but it ties into what you were just saying, actually. One is there evidence that there is actually economic growth that results in the communities around high-frequency rail?
Yes, if you're building new railways, there's a positive multiplier, macroeconomic multiplier, and railways. High-speed rail or new railway lines increase the mobility of labor or human capital, and this is the most important driver. So the mobility is higher when you have a better allocation of labor or human capital, and this is increasing the GDP. So there's a lot of economic research to that. Yeah?
Great. So another question is, in preparing I think is key, that everything is really done well in preparing for the program so that it doesn't end up with amendments and, stoppages and so on.
Yeah.
So what are the key success factors from your experience in the preparation phase?
So it starts really with the design phase, to have a long-term plan. So as I've said, who's most successful? Most successful are Switzerland and Austria, because they have a long-term timetable. They have a clear view how the timetable will look like in 2070. So they can say you at which date and which day of the week in the year 2071 a freight train or high-speed train will go from Zurich to Geneva. And then they have focused all the industry capabilities on this plan. This is really the plan. You need a long-term plan, and then each change request will increase the costs. So you need a clear vision, and then you will also have a very effective and productive mission to it.
Just on that, so a clear vision. So what are the key success factors to getting a clear vision? I like the idea of this very, very long-term view as being one of them. How do you balance between including everyone but actually getting things moving along? Like, what's the key there?
Yeah. It's difficult. You need a long-term. You need a long-term planning for the settlement structure, for regional planning, and this needs to be aligned. That's very important. And then you need compromise. In the end, you need compromise, and you cannot renegotiate each compromise after 5 or 6 years. So that's really the idea. If you have one set of the compromise, we will build this compromise. That's about it. So in each change request, again, will increase the costs.
Okay. Do I have more time, Chair?
You have 45 seconds, Ms. Murray.
Okay. So to what degree do you think it is important? What kinds of organizations need to be included in that preparation? I mean, obviously, the city government, the regional, and so on, the business community, but are there others that would surprise us that you think are key players to involve in the planning?
In the planning, you need each institution who has the right to decide about planning. That means construction, but also operations. And you have also include each institution who has to spend for it. These are the major institution you have to include.
So the funders is the most important, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Murray. Thank you, Mr. Brockmeyer. Mr. Barcelou-Duval, à vous la parole. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Over to you. You have 6 minutes. Mr. Barcelou-Duval, thank you, Chair. And thank you very much, Brockmeyer. Welcome to the Transport and Infrastructure community. I hope you can hear me well. I don't know if you understand French. Otherwise, there is interpretation available. Of course, I'd like to underline that I would have liked to put questions to Mr. Lavoie, but I'm of course happy to put questions to Mr. Brockmeyer as well. To start, drawing on the expertise developed in Europe, what is the operational model that exists? Because here we have questions about whether we should go for a high frequency or high speed rail, and also which model we should pursue. Is it a model where it's built privately and operated privately, or is it going to be a model where there's a type of public-private partnership for developing infrastructure with the private sector? But once the infrastructure has been built by the private sector, then it'll be managed and operated publicly, because at the moment we've got Via Rail. It's a state company that deals with passenger rail, but with this project it would be operated privately. So do you have success stories in Europe with a different way of doing things? Which model is used most frequently in Europe?
So as I've said already earlier, the model is different. So the infrastructure is owned by so-called infrastructure managers. They are state-owned, these are public institutions, and they are subsidized. And then we have operators. All the operators are so-called commercial operators, so they don't get subsidies for operations. We have a very few pure private players in Europe, like NTV in Italy, and they are very, very successful from a commercial perspective, as well as from operational perspective. That means performance and customer success. All other major operators in Europe are state-owned, but they are competing, Italian-owned, French-owned, whatever, but they are competing and they are least successful from this perspective. If we are looking into public-private partnership models for the infrastructure as you have, so it's always important to know and this is really like in English language, because you decide between financing and funding. Even if you have PPP models, you need funding from the public budget. So if you procure a PPP, you will not do it because you will get the money from the private sector. They will give you money maybe upfront, but in the end, if you want to go for a PPP, you will do that because you want to buy the capabilities. Yeah? If you don't have the capabilities in your country, then a PPP could be a good solution. But if it's about organizing funding, then it's still a matter for the public budget, because in the end, private operators are maybe more efficient, but they are not able to operate the infrastructure commercially.
Une autre question que j'aimerais vous poser, c'est...
Another question. When it comes to connections between cities, there's a discussion on this. Namely, when you get into urban centres, it becomes more costly to connect these urban centres because there's built-up infrastructure that you need to cross through to establish this connectivity. So there could be a temptation to say, let's do this in a rather lazy way and put a station somewhere far away from the downtown core. Or there might be other temptations or pressure locally where towns will say, we want to have a station here, so we might add in other stops in neighbouring towns along the route. So in your opinion, is that a good thing to do or not? In Europe, do you have stops in with TGV trains in urban centres or far out from the centres of cities? And is that the right approach?
Yeah. So especially the French have built high-speed rail from the outskirts of cities to the outskirts of cities. So they use the legacy network and the mixed traffic for the last mile to go into the city stations. And the same is true for all other European countries, with the exception of Spain. And this is a very good decision because it's so expensive to build additional tracks into city centers. This is really, I think, one of the advantages, and I've tried to address it in the beginning. This is also the determining capacity constraints, because you have to share this with mixed traffic and you have to bring them into city centers to make the connections to the metro systems, to the commuter rail systems, to have a good interchange of passengers between your intercity service system and the local trains. If you have smaller cities, and there are several examples from multiple countries in Europe, then you can really build stations at the outskirts, and then there will be big park and ride systems, for example, to bring commuters with the high-speed rail system to the major metropolitan areas. So make a long story short, go to the city centers of the most important cities from Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec, and build the stations outside of the smaller cities if possible. And if you can go easily through the cities, then you can do it well, but don't build any tunnels or so in the smaller cities that make no sense. The trade-off is too low of having an advantage to be in the city center of smaller cities.
20 secondes. OK, peut-être.
20 seconds. Well, perhaps I'll add that to another round, if you're indulgent. Thank you very much, Mr. Xavier Barcelon.
Correct. The floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And perhaps I'll just start by asking the clerk if my audio is sufficient for the interpreters.
We are indeed getting the thumbs up, Mr. Backrack. The floor is yours.
Hey, wonderful. And my apologies for the technical difficulties this morning. And thank you to Mr. Brockmeyer for joining us. His testimony has been very interesting. this study has touched on a number of issues, both technical issues and issues around the procurement model, and the question of how building high-frequency or high-speed rail can serve the national interest in a large country. And so I want to touch on a few of the aspects that we've been discussing so far over the course of the study. Now, your firm, I imagine, has worked on both publicly procured projects and projects that have a greater role for the private sector, including P3s. What would you say are the biggest differences between your involvement in public and private rail projects in Europe?
That's a very good question. I would say public projects are less designed to budget, and private projects are very designed to budget. So I would say this is the biggest difference. But in the end, as I've stated in the beginning, it's all based on public funding, even if you have a triple P project. Right. They are not quite common in Europe, but I would say it's really about the focus on the budget.
Right. There's only one rail rider, and so eventually the budget all comes back to either the passenger or the taxpayer.
Sure.
You highlighted Switzerland and Austria as examples of countries that have a long-term vision and that have really succeeded in incrementally building their high-speed rail network in the public interest. Could you talk about the operational models in those countries? Are these rail lines privately operated, or are they publicly operated? What's the role of the federal governments in those cases?
Yeah, so first of all, there's an important difference because Switzerland is not part of the European Union, so they don't have to apply to EU law. That means the business in Switzerland is still a little different. So this is operated completely by SBB, that's the national operator, the Swiss Federal Railways. In Austria, it's different where we have two operators. One is the state-owned operator, ÖBB, Austrian Federal Railways, and there's also a private operator. It's called Westbahn, but its minority shareholder is SNCF from France. So there's the difference in the model. They are both very successful. In Switzerland, they are commercial. But as I said earlier, the subsidies are in the infrastructure, so they pay a very little track access charge to the infrastructure manager, but it's not covering the full cost, but it's incentive not to use too many tracks. And we have the same model in Austria, and both operators have been very successful commercially until Corona, and then they decided to change the system, and now they are both public service obliged.
So in Canada, the project that we're talking about, the current government's HFR proposal, the terms of reference for this project are essentially that the private sector will take a major role in designing the project. They will finance the infrastructure. They will operate the trains, and they will set the schedule and fares. Now, when you think about the long-term public interest, what are the questions that you would have about how the government should ensure that 100 years from now, the public interest has been protected, given the role of the private sector in the government's current conception of things?
Yeah, so this really depends on what's the period of the contract. So I'm not very familiar with the PPP model, which is in place in Canada already, or what the plans are. What you really need is you need, as I said earlier, you need a long-term vision. Yeah? Why I have a rail system, and what's the long-term plan? How many? How should look like the schedule in the long term? And then if you using a private consortia or so to build and operate the system, you have to agree very early on the long-term schedule. So what's the supply side in terms of intervals and in terms of capacity you expect in 2030, 2040, 2050. There you have to be very clear. And then on the same side, you have really be careful to calculate very careful how much capacity I need on the new build stretches as well as on the city access stretches. That's very, very important. I would say if you have that.
You mentioned that in.
No, go ahead.
Mr. Brockmeyer, I've just got one more minute. You mentioned that public-private partnerships are usually about buying capabilities. They're not really about, securing financing, or they shouldn't be, or these other factors. We talk about risk transfer. When it comes to buying capabilities, are there other procurement models that allow you to secure the capabilities of the private sector while retaining public ownership and public operation of the service? So does your firm work on publicly operated and publicly owned rail projects in Europe and bring your capability to those projects so that they can tap into the innovation that you bring?
Yeah, we will do this, but we do more of the management stuff. But it's quite common. So, for example, I will give you another example. As some Scandinavian countries have decided to introduce the European Rail Traffic Management System, they had no capabilities to do that. Then they hired all the engineers they can get from all over Europe, from Spain, Portugal, Italy, and they brought them to Norway, to Denmark, and set up the system in their public-owned infrastructure managers. So they bought all the capabilities from the engineering consultancies. That's the other way around. Huh? So if you don't have the capabilities, it's different in Switzerland and Germany. They have the capabilities. They don't need the engineers. They have the engineering consultants. They have their own engineers.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brockmeyer, and thank you, Mr. Backrack.
Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Brockmeyer, for your perspective from Europe, because I think that's it's been fairly interesting. Personally, I've traveled on the TGVs in France years ago on a trip, and it was an interesting experience. So that's my only vantage point on European rail. So you talked about the 4-hour mark as being a little bit of the tipping point in terms of viability in competing versus air. So what happens after the 4-hour mark? I mean, where what does it look like at 5, 6, et cetera?
Yeah. So then you are losing market share to flights. So very simple. So if you are above 7 or 8 hours, it makes no sense to it. There are still rail travelers, but not with a very high willingness to pay, because that's slow travel. You can see this if you're looking into city pairs in Europe. If a travel time goes below 4 hours, the rail is dominating, and below 3 hours, there are no flights. Very simple. Okay. And if it's above, then the share of rail is decreasing.
So what about regions of Europe? Because you talked about the string of pearls, and that makes sense, particularly where there are across the parts of Germany where there are those cities close together. What happens in other areas of the country? I mean, Canada is a very vast country, and we're talking about a proposal for high-frequency rail in one region of the country for billions of dollars going to be borne by taxpayers in all regions of the country. So, are there many examples, or are they less economic than in other parts of Europe?
So it's always, so I think there are two questions. One of all, make it sense for a federal level to build it for a specific region. Then in the end, it's yes, because we can increase the GDP, because all these investments have a positive multiplier from a macroeconomic perspective. The other question, it makes no sense to build railways in areas where no people live. So they have these exceptions in France where you have a distance of 200, 300 kilometers without a stop between two cities. So, but I would say this is more or less the longest stretch which makes sense. So if you have, for example, a stretch which is 500, 600, 700 kilometers, that would be, the distance would be much too far when we have to talk about the electrification of airplanes or whatever. That would be much more, make much more sense from a transport mode choice.
Sure, and you talked about terrain being an important factor in determining the cost of building these. And while it may look like it's a flat, smooth terrain, we are going through parts of the Canadian Shield, which is hard as rock, obviously, on the routes that are being proposed. So, I mean, there would be bridges. There'd be actually probably quite a few bridges, given the number of creeks and rivers and lakes. So, bridges versus tunnels. I mean, what are the cost impacts of those?
So it depends. If you have let's say a stretch where you build mostly at grade, but maybe with a few embankments, a small little bridge, little nice river. You can say in euros it's somewhere between 30 let's say in current price is 30, 40 million euros. Let's say 50 or so Canadian dollars per kilometer. If you build them in a more mountainous region, so you get up from 80 million euro to somewhere 100, 120. It really depends on the rock where you have to build the tunnel. And so to give you a hint, so you can say if you build a tunnel, you can double at least the price for a rail system.
So what has been, because we've talked a lot about high-speed rail, and certainly that was my experience in France, albeit just one country and one point in time. Are there high-frequency rail systems operating in Europe, and why is that the case in that particular region or along those routes versus high-speed rail? And what has been the ridership difference and economic differences?
So I think most of the rail systems in, let's say, at least in Central Europe, are high-frequency rail systems. So it's a standard that you have a 60 minutes headway or 30 minutes headway on most of the important intercity stretches. What's the difference? I would say the important difference is from 160 kilometer onwards, because above 160 kilometers, you need continuous train supervision. Before that, you have a discrete one it's a little cheaper, and the infrastructure is not very complex. Above 160, it's becoming much more complex, and then it's increasing exponentially with increasing the speed, and not the technical, not the safety system. It's more about, again, it's about building all the civils, tunnels, bridges, and that stuff. So if you're building 350, 400 kilometers per hour, then it really depends again on the topography.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Muse, and thank you once again, Mr. Brockmeyer. Next, prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Iacono. Monsieur Iacono, la parole est...
And now, Mr. Iacono, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair.
Time with my colleague, the Chair. So, Mr. Brockmeyer, your company's goal is to improve the quality of life in public spaces. And what drives your company is city, activity, civilization, velocity, civitas, vivre. I would refer to la joie de vivre. So tell us, what country in Europe comes closest to Canada? Because, you know, the Canadian climate is very different. The demographics are very different than Europe. So which of the European countries would you suggest would be the most appropriate one for us to look at to create a better vision of our future rail system?
Yeah, very good question. I would say Scandinavia. Unfortunately, Scandinavia is not a country. But if you're looking into the Scandinavian rail system consisting of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, it's very worth to look into from climate perspective. We're talking about snow, for example, about storms, but also how they have improved their rail system, because they have also decided not to go for very high-speed rail. They have decided to go for, let's call it not really high-frequency rail. They've got, let's say, conventional upgraded rail lines, and there you can really see if you do you can do it cheap, as the Swedish has done, or you can then you have to compare it really to other countries where you have
when you refer to conventional, would that be a mixture of HFR and HSR?
Yeah, it's more. They use upgraded lines, so they improved a little bit their infrastructure, and then they've bought so-called tilting rolling stock. So it's really tilting in the curves, and that leads to the possibility to improve the speed up to let's say 200 kilometers per hour. But if you're looking into that, they are still not competitive against air. For example, I think it's a very good comparison if you're comparing the connection between Stockholm and Gothenburg, and at the same time between, for example, Ottawa and Toronto. And then you can really see how it looks like if you have a conventional upgraded system and not a new build system. It's very important. It's not a new build system. And if you're looking more into new build systems, then it's difficult. Because the climate is so different if you're going to France or Spain. Then I would more suggest to look into some parts of Germany.
So if we look at our present rail system in Canada, we noticed that it caters to mainly the big cities and not the smaller regions, etc. So how can we increase our ridership? How can we make this rail service more closer to the population? Would that be by using high speed, or would that be by using high frequency? What would be more appropriate for in your conclusions?
Both. No, of course, the frequency is most important. Now, I would say what's most important is reliability. So the people have to, the timetable, it's this is a product, yeah, and it has to be reliable and it has to be on time, and then it has to be, of course, frequent in the next step. So it makes no sense to have a train once a day or 2 trains per day. So you need a train every 2 hours or every hour. That's the important part. And then the next step is really to increase the speed to reduce travel time, because it makes no sense to have a very high-speed system with 1 train per day. So I think that's obvious. So I would say for speed, frequency is a necessary condition. And if you have high speed, frequency should be ultimately the result of it.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Iacono, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Iacono.
For your time. Mr. Brockmeyer, thank you for your expertise today. Just following up on your comments regarding the Scandinavian countries and the decision they made to go with more of an upgraded model of their tracks and their systems, did they make that decision because from a logistical perspective, with the climate that they have, which is very similar to the climate, very harsh climate that we have here in Canada, high-speed rail wasn't an option? Or
No.
If you could expand on that, because there's a debate here between whether or not Canada has a climate that can accommodate high-speed rail. What are your thoughts on that?
No, it was a budget decision. So the Swedish decided not to spend that much capex on the lines. If you're going, for example, for Norway, they have a lot of money due to their oil fields, and so they built a complete new high-speed rail network. If it makes sense or not, let's discuss it on a different time. But so they really built a high-speed rail system, very expansive one, and they have the same harsh climate.
And what tools are they using to cope with the harsh climate that they have? The technology does exist, correct?
Yes, of course, the technology exists. You have to build a little bit more robust. You have to spend a little bit more on a few items. There are some design features, but in general, it's not an issue. If you have a heavy snowstorm, then you have no chance. But when there are also no airline operations, so when everybody has to stay at home, I think that's a better decision.
Thank you, Mr. Brockmeyer. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole.
And now Mr. Barcelou-Duval for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. So I will continue with Mr. Brockmeyer. Well, currently, to give you an example, the distance between Montreal and Quebec City, 250 kilometres, and it takes about 2 hours 45 in car, and in the train, it takes about 3 hours 20 if the train leaves on time and arrives on time. And the proposed project, if it's a high-frequency rail, it would take 3 hours. So it would still be longer by train than by car, and you would lose the flexibility of being able to leave when you want and park where you want, etc. So do you think that it's a project that's worth it, even if the car is still advantageous and they were leaving aside planes? Or should we go towards a high-speed rail, and where we win more time, perhaps we could increase the number of people taking it?
Yeah, I would say yes. So the important thing is you always have to consider the catchment area. As far as I know, you don't have a lot of connecting trains in the urban rail transport hubs. So if you want to improve the overall travel journey times, then we really have to look we really have to consider the first and last mile. The people have to go to the city station, and they have to leave the city station destination to somewhere else, to the final destination. And we always have to optimize the overall journey times. So you need really a transport or mobility mode model for the overall system. And so if you want to be competitive against the car and about the convenience and all the stuff, then you need at least very competitive travel times. That means you couldn't be that much. You can need that much more time as you have to use with the car. That's it.
On parle de combien de différence en pourcentage de temps par rapport?
So would be the difference in percentage between the cars at 15, 30% quicker than the car? What should we actually aim for in order to win people over to the train rather than the car?
So I wouldn't say that there's a strict KPI. Then there are also a lot of other factors, like you also have some convenience in the train. You can work. You don't have to control your car or to take a wheel or whatever. So there is no clear KPI, but you definitely have to be faster. That's all I can say. Yeah. So if you're looking into the high-speed rail systems in Europe, it's roughly between 10 and 40%.
Thank you very much. Rough. Merci, Mr. Bars-Duval, and thank you, Mr. Bruckmeyer. And last, for our first hour, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Bruckmeyer. I wanted to pick up on the question of access to city centers. It seems like when we're talking about the total trip length and trying to ensure that modal shift, we need to ensure that the new line is connecting with other modes of transportation and existing legacy transit in those cities. How important do you feel it is that the government's objectives from the outset frame the journey length as downtown to downtown?
So it's a very important measure, of course, if a downtown is important. So you still have a very high, we call it local demand. So that means the local demand in the city centers. So this is really driving the demand for business trips and so for the travelers with a high willingness to pay. And this is really driving the business case of high-speed rail. So the journey times from downtown to downtown, if downtown is important, that's always has to be considered, is very, very important. Yeah. And then again, it's about the connection of a city station. It's well connected and so on.
You mentioned the need to avoid bridges and tunnels, particularly tunnels, due to the cost. One of the features we have in Canada when it comes to our current rail network is a lot of level crossings. And I've heard this cited as one of the cost factors when it comes to building higher speed rail. You need to deal with and eliminate all of those level crossings because they don't function with high speed trains. Is that a situation you've come across in Europe, and how do European projects manage that?
Yeah, it's an issue above 160 kilometers per hour. You cannot use level crossings, so you need small bridges on flying over the railway lines. I think you can do two ways, in the European way or in the UK style. In Europe, it's not really a cost driver. So if you're looking into CapEx projects to build the bridges, I'm not talking about the rail bridges, I'm talking about the super bridges. They are not driving the costs. If you're looking into high-speed 2, then this is really an issue. They've built very complex bridges to cross right now they're building them to cross railway lines. So in the UK, it's unfortunately the case. It's very expensive to build them, but it's completely different if you're looking into mainland Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach, and I would like to thank all of our witnesses, particularly Mr. Bruckmeyer, for your generous time today, for being so technical and sharing so much of your expertise with our committee on this very important study. With that, I'll ask the witnesses to log off. Colleagues, we will take a 5-minute break. I will suspend to come back for our second session. Thank you, everyone. Back to order. Colleagues, for the second half of our meeting today, we have appearing before us as witnesses Mr. Bruno de Brussen, Manager, Urban Transport Department, by video conference from International Transport Workers Federation. Welcome. As well as Mr. Joel Kennedy, National Rail Director, Unifor, by video conference as well. Nous avons aussi Monsieur Pierre Barriot.
We also have Mr. Pierre Barriot, Lecturer, Faculty of Environmental Design, School of Urban Planning and Landscape Architecture from the Université de Montréal. Welcome to all of you. So we'll start, Mr. Barriot, with your opening comments. You have 5 minutes. Over to you. Thank you. And thank you for having given this opportunity to me to speak about this fundamental issue. The myth of the construction of modern cadenas places TRAN in an important position. Canada, with the British North American Acts, where the constitutional document speaks the most about rail in the whole world. However, over the last 50 years, railways have been relegated to a goods transport vehicle because of budgetary cuts and chronic underfunding and bad technological choices and bad projects that have been chosen. But this is also due to the fact that the Canadian population has been asking valid questions. Is it really relevant for us? Is it a truly Canadian project when the train goes through my town once or twice a week? Is this a service that really allows me to be less dependent on my car? And the answer is no. If we want to support a project such as the high-frequency or the high-speed rail, then it's not just about relaunching rail in the east of Canada. If we want to support the population, we also have to support projects such as the Calgary-Edmonton line towards the west, and we have to also support the links between Vancouver and the U.S., Toronto to the U.S., and relaunch other services as well. So relaunching rail services in Canada has to take place in a way where rails are perhaps serving certain towns that are not so relevant, but it will also be it's because of political decisions that it's become less relevant, and that's what's led people to this particular analysis of the situation, that it's not relevant. Thank you very much, Mr. Barriot. And now, Mr. Brussen.
The floor over to you. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning to members of the committee. Good afternoon, actually. Thank you for the opportunity to present ITF's testimony in this important study. The International Transport Workers Federation is a global trade union federation comprising 700 affiliated trade unions from 153 countries, including in Canada our rail affiliates, International Brotherhood of Teamsters and Unifor Canada, who is present today here with my colleague Joel Kennedy. And we have nearly 20 million affiliated transport workers as members of our organization. Our mission is to safeguard the rights of all transport workers through its global network of affiliated trade unions. So upon reviewing the testimony presented to this committee on November 6, we note that there is a consensus regarding the advantages of a high-frequency rail project, including the obvious benefits for passengers, economic growth, through job creation and the environmental advantages associated with rail's low carbon emissions. And while we strongly endorse public investment in enhancing and expanding railway systems, we also share some of the concerns that were expressed by Unifor before this committee regarding the public-private partnership model that is being promoted in this case. The ITF has found that privatization has led to fragmented and inefficient rail systems and contributed to a decline in the quality of the services and the quality of work for the workers involved through PPPs. Public-private partnerships in major national and international transport services have incurred in some significant financial losses. Unrealistic bids from the private sector to secure contracts have resulted in failures on major routes, burdening governments with financial responsibilities, and often leading to substantial subsidies from taxpayers and passengers. Private sector financing has proven more expensive than the public sector alternative, with profits directed to shareholders causing underinvestment in services. Nowhere this is clearer than in the United Kingdom. The privatized rail system requires more public funding than it did before the wave of liberalization. Ticket prices for passengers have surged in the UK, and the UK rail users are some of the most dissatisfied passengers of Europe. The failure of privatization and PPPs have resulted in rail services being renationalized or operated as joint government ventures, such as an example with the Figueres-Perpignan high-speed rail between France and Spain. Despite the initial promises, it has been up to the public purse to sustain failed private endeavors. Similarly, the Argentine national government was forced to renationalize train services after a tragic accident due to poor maintenance and lack of repairs that took place in 2012. In Kenya, the Standard Gauge Railway, a PPP with the China Rail and Bridge Corporation, faced transparency issues and operational challenges, leading to state takeover just 4 years into the 10-year contract. Private sector financing, including PPPs, often entails social costs such as poorer working conditions and risks to the health and safety of transport workers, of passengers, and also of affected communities. This has been reported by our affiliated unions operating in railway systems around the globe. A 2012 study of rail PPPs globally revealed that these projects are successful only when public authorities guarantee profits for private concessionaires. Rail projects where concessionaires assume financial risk, they tend to fail. The Asian Development Bank highlighted in a review of thousands of PPPs around the world that out of 6,273 PPP projects, only 216 were completed between 1991 and 2015, and the vast majority of them had to be put on hold. The UK's experience, again, with rail privatization, including the London Tube System and National Railway Services, illustrates failures, escalating costs, and adverse outcomes for workers and passengers. When the Eurotunnel was built, the overestimates on ridership, as well as escalating construction costs, meant liabilities had to be restructured in 1997 and again in 2007. And adding to that, they had to also increase the contract from 55 years to 99 years to guarantee a minimum revenue for the private concessionaires. Conversely, Germany, Spain, South Korea demonstrate successfully publicly funding high-speed rail system. Positive outcomes include reduced travel times, economic development, and improved connectivity. So in conclusion, PPPs and other forms of privatization and contracting out fail to deliver the promised savings, and in many cases simply fail, as mentioned above. The ITF recommends that the government reviews the HFR structure and takes bold steps to invest in a genuine, sustainable, publicly passenger rail system, one that is publicly owned, publicly operated, and democratically controlled with good working conditions and safety that ensures a good quality service. We hope this will contribute to reconsidering the HFR project as it stands today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. De Brusen. We'll begin our line of questioning in this round with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Mr. Barrio. I thought it was an interesting question. Is it a Canadian project that you asked, and what would get that buy-in? Obviously, we've heard from communities along the route with proposed stops along the route who are very much in favor of it. What's your view on how the project as proposed is viewed in communities that perhaps are on the current via line, the slow train, if we want to call it that? How are they viewing the project when they are not going to be a stop on the new project? And how do you think the new project can address those concerns of those communities that perhaps feel that they are being bypassed?
That's a very interesting question. Every time we do proceed with a route change, this has significant impact on communities that feel abandoned and communities that are now energized by having a new service. I've been a long proponent of a bigger picture, in that if we take this segment between Montreal and Quebec City, I'm not necessarily against going on the North Shore instead of the South Shore. It means we can diminish our reliance on the bridge between Quebec and Lévis, and we get out of the CN corridor. However, we have to build bridges. We have to build partnerships. And I strongly believe the solution to fix what you're talking about is quite simple. In Montreal, we have something called commuter rail, which are trains that are running in one line between Montreal and Mont-Saint-Hilaire. It would be quite simple in the private sector, hopefully not excruciatingly painful for the public sector to negotiate a deal with the provincial government's EXO and quite simply just bring a few of the trains that are running between Montreal and Mont-Saint-Hilaire to 2 more stops, being in Saint-Hilaire and Drummondville. By doing that, you're basically serving almost the totality of the traffic with very little subsidy compared to running trains, which are going to be mostly empty if Via Rail is forced to continue to operate regular trains on the South Shore.
We heard in our previous panel about that the typical cost for a ticket to go from a regular train, the current service, this was in Europe, it cost about 100% more, 50 to 100% more to once a new high-frequency or high-speed rail service was implemented. Have you done any work on, obviously people like the idea, they like the way it sounds, increased connectivity, more frequent rail, modern services, etc. But then when it comes down to paying for it, have you seen it? Have you done any modeling, or are there any studies that you're aware of that have looked at what are people willing to pay for that shiny new service?
Well, you're asking a multifaceted question, and it's actually also a fascinating question if you want to do a little wordplay on it. We have to understand here, high-frequency rail is not going to significantly increase ticket price if we compare to other services around the world. And in many cases, actually, high-frequency rail was able to bring sufficient ridership to bring a decrease. If we go high-speed rail, then it's a whole new ballgame. If you go in Italy, if you go in France, you're going to have a 2-tiered system. The faster you go, the higher you pay with high-speed rail. So in that case, that's a significantly important question. So yes, high-frequency rail is potentially going to bring higher costs. I would bring, however, one footnote to that is we are now seeing the rise of low-cost high-speed rail in Europe, including UI being operated by SNCF, which is actually running high-frequency rail on a low-cost airline model, which is bringing costs down. So that's what we're seeing right now on the market in Europe, and what we're seeing elsewhere in many countries, including South Korea and Japan.
So I want to go back to your first answer where you talked about running empty trains once the HFR is built. When VIA came before us, the current operation, they believed that the new line, the new passenger-only dedicated line, wouldn't have an impact on their business. Do you agree with that? That's hard to believe that it wouldn't if there's significant passenger volumes being redirected to the HFR project. Because I bring this up because you did mention running empty trains. Do you think that is a risk to the current mainline communities and that the viability of the current VIA model? Do you view this as a competitor, or is it complementary?
Well, it is complementary. However, the current ridership level is hard to sustain that complementary service in that because basically it's the following, almost the totality of the ridership between Montreal and Quebec City, they're going to go automatically on the higher speed and higher frequency service. They're not going to stay on the slow traffic. So who's going to stay on that line is the people going to St. Hyacinthe and going to Drummondville. And that is a small percentage of the current market share. So, and if we take that market share of St. Hyacinthe and of Drummondville, the vast majority of those people are actually going towards Montreal, not towards Quebec City. So therefore, the Drummondville, the Quebec City, is the segment that could in terms of feasibility, be diminished. And let's not forget that Via Rail could also decide to operate a code share with a bus service, which would also significantly lower operating costs. But I see very rare experiences around the world where we have a service which would be 40% faster, which will be every hour, and people would decide, no, I prefer to take the unreliable and slower routes.
Merci, Mr. Berriot. Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do, Mr. Chair, want to preface my comments to state that the committee study will, in fact, contribute to the planning. or some of the information that VHFR will utilize within their planning process. And with that said, it is important that the analysts hear the testimony that will achieve that important input that then will be featured in our final report to the Minister. Mr. Chair, through Budget 2022, Transport Canada and Infrastructure Canada received $396.8 million in funding over the next 2 years to advance this project through the procurement phase. And as part of the planning process, I do want to ask Mr. Berrio, with your experience as a urban planner in landscape architecture, how important is it to work with the local level of government to recognize both municipal official plans as well as their secondary plans that add capacity, infrastructure capacity to those official plans? How important is it to recognize those two segments of the planning process within a local community to ensure compatible land use planning?
It's fundamental. If we look at train systems that are successes around the world, they are those that have worked with cities and communities in building high-density destinations around train stations. As long as we build train stations where people live far away and that they're hard to get to and that there's not much to do around, it's hard to get ridership. And the reality is, while the Ottawa train station is beautiful, reality is if we still had the old Rideau station downtown on Rideau, it would have been, ridership would be higher. So what we have to do here is build communities around these stations, also connect with airports, which is fundamental. Those are the two main drivers for ridership, airports and downtowns. So that's what we have to work on. And the federal government has to create these partnerships and with cities and communities to get the ball rolling.
Thank you, Mr. Berrio, and I'm happy you said that because that will now go on the record as well as be part of our final report because of its importance. So we've heard that priority is dedicated track for both HFR and HSR. So we're going to dedicate track between trade and people, which is a great thing. However, I think we really have to be cognizant on what high speed actually does and high frequency actually does, and that being high frequency stops a lot. And with that, it's very difficult to then have high speed and get up to those speeds when you have to stop a lot and or have trains in front of you that are stopping a lot. So I guess I'll rely on possibly some experience that you may have on the infrastructure of track. So a dedicated track to people and to allow for high speed on a high speed and high frequency track. Can sidings be built on the main line or off the main line to allow high frequency to frequently stop and make room for high speed?
Yes. However, I would not go towards the siding approach. It's more getting 4-track stations. The idea that we see in most successful European and Asian systems is that you do the scheduling and that at a local stop, the train is able to stop locally and the high-speed train is able to bypass it while it's loading and unloading passengers. A bit like the transitway in Ottawa used to operate, in which buses, while they were loading and offloading, there were the bypass lanes where the buses that were direct service could go straight, and those that were embarking and disembarking traffic, let's say at Herdman Station, they were able to bypass it. So that's sort of, you're able to build 2 tracks on the full length, and at your stations, you build 4. And that's where you schedule the bypassing.
Thank you, Mr. Berrio. Now, it was mentioned also, and I want to ensure that this stays on the record, that alignment with all methods of transportation is very important. Keeping in mind a benefit to this is, again, as I said earlier, the separation of lines, trade and people for moving goods and people. But the importance of aligning all methods of transportation, including aligned service providers. So we have airports, we have, in my area, we have the Great Lakes ship or cruising, Great Lakes shipping. We have other methods of transportation, such as road. Again, in my area, we have Metrolinx that has GO Transit coming in from the GTA. And, of course, we have intermunicipal transit systems and short lines. So, again, how important is it to align the different methods of transportation as well as the transportation systems all in one area?
It's fundamental. If we want to diminish the dependency of Canadians on the automobile, we have to give them a viable option. And that viable option comes by having a system which brings them from everywhere to everywhere. And as long as we are not able to provide a viable alternative to the automobile, people won't use it. I own a car. Why? Because transit doesn't bring me everywhere I have to go in an efficient way. And you give the example of the commuter train in Toronto, and a great example of service integration is what we have in suburban Los Angeles, where a monthly pass holder can jump on the Amtrak train or on the Metrolink of Los Angeles between the same stations. And that permits people to try Amtrak and use it sometimes, and you're bringing more riders and you're filling up trains.
Okay.
And it's always a question of filling up the vehicles to diminish passenger cost.
Thank you, Mr. Berriot. Last question: with respect to our domestic benefits, and to try and create more both capital and operating, I'll use the word funding, to then help not only pay for the system but pay for the managing of the system as time goes on, and as time goes on with the replacement that will be needed 30, 40, 50 years on the road. Do you feel also that not only should we be discussing this here in Canada with our partners, but we should be discussing it binationally with our American partners too? So therefore, we're actually connecting, for example, Toronto to New York, Toronto to Chicago to Detroit, in those areas as well. Do you think that's important that we actually start embarking on that discussion as well?
Short answer, please, Ms. Berriot.
Yes, I would say the American government has been a better partner than the Canadian government, and that Amtrak comes into Montreal and Toronto and Vancouver, and Via Rail is lacking in terms of cooperation compared to our American friends on the south.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berriot, and thank you, Mr. Badaway. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Now, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witnesses. I'll start with Mr. Berriot. Those were very interesting comments. It leads us in lots of different directions. I hope I can cover all of that. I'll start with an interview that you gave to Radio-Canada in July 2021, where you said roughly that high-frequency train prepares the way for high-speed rail. I thought that was interesting because it's right at the heart of our debate. Should we go for high-speed or high-frequency rail, or a hybrid between the two? And the question that came to me, and perhaps you could answer this, why would we invest tens of millions into a high-frequency rail system and saying we'll start the work so that we can have high-speed rail in 10, 15, 20, 30 or 50 years' time? Because is it realistic to think that after all the time that it will have taken to, for example, take 10 or 15 years to get high-speed rail, are we going to start this work with high frequency to then shift to high speed? How do you think all this is going to operate? I think your timetable is a bit optimistic with your timelines. I think that you have to convince the federal government to construct, for example, an HFR. It'll probably take half a decade before there's appetite then to get high-speed rail off the ground. So I think that Canadians are really ready for a high-speed rail. I think we have a market for this, and I think that the Canadian airport system is saturated, and environmental studies will be difficult to allow us to increase airport capacity. So it's better to remove, for example, Ottawa-Toronto or Ottawa-Montreal flights, or Toronto-London, and get them on trains. But when it comes to appetite, the federal government doesn't seem that we want to have a 100 billion system built. So given that, there was then the strategy of having some sort of hybrid train. Sometimes it would be high speed, sometimes it wouldn't be. But I think you should draw inspiration from the French government when they constructed the line at 300 kilometers per hour between Paris and Lyon. Then it continues to Marseille at a lower speed, but with the same tracks. So the Canadian government could to take Montreal, Ottawa, that segment, and specify that that's mainly owned by Via Rail, take that segment and really upgrade it massively. So all of the trains between Montreal and Toronto could go through Ottawa, and that would increase the speed and the frequency. And at the start, we could then slowly but surely go towards Quebec City, perhaps around 160 kilometers per hour. And as we're able to open things up, we can improve the situation gradually. That's one way of doing things, because if we take the corridor, for example, that goes through Peterborough, and we take it as it stands, there's going to be problems with the curves. And the radius is going to be too tight for an HFR, and many of the expenditure will be thrown in the trash can. And I'd just like to draw a parallel with what happened with the Transitway in Ottawa once again, where the planner said, yes, we'll have a bus system and almost most of the investment will be maintained. So if we decide to put a train on this, but the reality is when we did the old train, we had to spend a great deal to actually expand the 417 to put buses on that, and there were 6 years of construction, and most of the investment was lost for the OT train. So this idea of having incremental upgrades, that's what we're being sold, but when it comes to putting it into practice, it's not as easy as it's been purported to be. Thank you. So you've talked about the aim of this project. We want to reduce car and aviation traffic and increase the use of trains. But unfortunately, our impression is that if we have travel time, which goes from 3:20 to 3 hours with this proposed train, it's still not going to be very attractive for Montreal, Quebec City. It won't be competitive vis-a-vis cars. So we're talking about a high-frequency rail. That's what the government is proposing. Others want high-speed rail. Then others are saying perhaps we should have a hybrid solution with HFR, and it's sometimes high speed on certain segments. Is that a solution that would allow us to win time so we could actually compete with cars and planes? Because it seems that with what's being proposed, we're just spending a great deal of money, but we're not really increasing ridership. Yes, Montreal, Quebec City, that's a problematic example, because if you know the sector, the trains that come in from Quebec City have to go to Dorval and then do a U-turn to come back into the centre of town because the trains cannot come in easily to the downtown core. So I am amongst those who are asking whether the HSR really needs to come into downtown Montreal. If the answer is no, if you could have somewhere around Saint Laurent, a mega station at Dorval, and then with the REM, it takes 4 minutes to get down to Saint Laurent to connect them. Then you can get rid of 20 minutes in the transit up to Quebec City. So you have to optimize this. Is it a real mantra? Do you have to get into Montreal? If you look at what's happening in Japan, the high-speed rail doesn't go into the downtown core. It's too expensive to build the tunnels. So here we can optimize the circuit and the route. Not everyone agrees with this. People fundamentally sometimes think that trains should come into the centre of Montreal. But if we can save 20 minutes on that segment, I would prefer to do TGV plus REM, so the high-speed rail plus REM. Now, for the rest of the segments, we can win back more time, in particular with Ottawa-Montreal. We have to remember that the Ottawa-Montreal train and the Via Rail train with the high-frequency rail will come to 1 hour 20. We had that several years ago. Thank you very much, Mr. Barrio and Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Now, Mr. Backrack, and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with some questions for Mr. Debruzen. Mr. Debruzen, I read over your brief that you provided the committee, and it's very detailed and interesting and really lays out and describes in detail the pitfalls of the public-private model when it comes to rail development around the world. My first question is, given the track record of public-private partnerships in the rail sector internationally, why do you think the government of Canada seems so hell-bent on proceeding with such a problematic model for this HFR project?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking. I think there is a similar pattern to what we've seen with other governments around the world. There is this idea that by doing a public-private partnership, it's going to be less expensive for a government budget, and that is not going to be the government will not be ultimately responsible for it. And I think this is one of the key motivations behind why any government is really going into this. So we're not going to spend much on it. It's going to be the private sector, and also we're not going to be responsible for operations. So if anything fails, or if there are any problems, we can kind of put it on the private sector as well. And I think those two are key mistakes, because at the end of the day, what we've seen across the world in the vast majority of PPP projects it ends up being on the public and it ends up being on the government and not just the federal government, on the other levels of government that may also jump into a proposal like this.
So there isn't really a risk transfer to the private sector. In the end, it's the passengers and the citizens that end up paying for the rail project, regardless of what model is employed. Do they end up paying more or less, in your view, under public-private partnerships?
The evidence is that they end up paying more. So I think the example of the UK perhaps may be one of the most tangible for us to see. After 30 years of rail privatization and PPP projects all over its rail system, is now one of the most expensive rails in Europe, not just to operate, but for the passengers, and also has worse working conditions for workers when compared to other systems like the French or the German one that have remained in public hands. On top of that, they had to extend contracts. So when you look at the Eurotunnel, that was a PPP project, they had to extend that concession by 40 years because they could the profits of the private concessionaires were not guaranteed in the original span of time that they had set, which was 55 years. So that's another example where we end up paying from the public and also paying more than originally stipulated.
Now, you mentioned your two Canadian affiliates, Unifor and the Teamsters, and it's wonderful to have Mr. Kennedy here with us as well. Do your affiliates in Canada support the government's current approach to HFR?
I'll pass it on to Joel to respond to that. Yeah.
So currently, no, we don't. And our position, as we had mentioned on November 6th, we had our elected representative, Jen Murray, come and do a presentation on this committee, is that, no, we don't support the government's proposal on HFR.
And does it not seem misguided to forge ahead with a project model that isn't supported by the two main labor organizations that represent the people who are going to be operating the trains?
It certainly is irresponsible in our view. I think that, both the stakeholders, the Teamsters and myself, and I can speak on behalf of the Teamsters, I do have their blessing. They do agree with our position, and they do wholeheartedly stand behind us in this regard, is that what we've seen with proposals like this is they're not thought out, they're more whimsical, and it's more of a pipe dream. What we need here in Canada is a well thought out plan for a national transportation network that's accessible to all Canadians, and something that's going to be a gold standard for the next 100 years, and that's also in line with our green initiatives. And when we see private enterprises come into these in proposals, as my colleague Bruno has also mentioned, we see working conditions, wages, and all sorts of things, and towards health and safety diminish as well.
Mr. de Bruzen, you're familiar with some of the companies, both private and state-owned, that are currently putting forward proposals for the HFR project. What are those companies' records working in other countries on rail projects? And do you have concerns in that regard?
Well, I wouldn't say they have a unique record. It's a pattern, I think, with many other companies. What I think it's sometimes shocking for us to see is the difference on how they operate in their home countries, where they're often publicly owned and state-led. So Keolis being one example, that is one of the bidders here. And when they operate abroad, including in North America, in the US and Canada, where Keolis has a large presence, they do not follow the same patterns that they follow at home. And especially one of our biggest concerns is how they deal with labor relations, undercutting, for example, staffing, trying to review collective bargaining agreements that were in place before it was privatized, and now under their management, reviewing them to lower the overall operating cost. Because usually these companies basically try to underbid each other. And one of the areas where they cut in those bids, it's in labor cost, and that then later transfers not just to working conditions, but to safety as well. Another of the operators, just to mention, it's Renfe, which is a Spanish-owned operator, and we've also seen problems with Renfe. They're part of one of the bids in the Texas project for HSR that has been delayed for, I think, about a decade. Renfe had just gone through a change in its management because of a corruption scandal in Spain. So nobody has a perfect record on this, and certainly these are concerns that we have.
Thank you, Mr. de Bruzen, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. For our second round, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. So some more questions for Mr. Mario. You talked about in the Montreal-Quebec City corridor about how basically HFR will render via, well, it would basically take all their passengers and make it economically unviable, and that beyond the passengers going from Montreal to Quebec City, you'd have those in the outer lying stations that were frankly could be using provincially or municipally operated transit lines rather than HFR. So I'm wondering if, in your view, or if you looked at the Ontario side of the proposed route, because it does run a little bit more northerly through Peterborough, whether that's the same case, whether, Toronto to Ottawa, Toronto to Montreal, we would cannibalize the via passengers, and whether there be any benefit beyond that.
Well, I think the same model which I proposed for Montreal could potentially be a partnership built between GO Transit and Metrolink with Via Rail and extending a few of their trains to Belleville, for example, or something like that. But the reality is going by Peterborough, I mean, we're using the old CP line. It is a complicated line. It's not an easy line to get to Toronto. There's issues of entering Toronto as well from the north. Historically, it's easy to enter Toronto east and west. There's a lot of rail infrastructure that's available. There's right-of-ways. The Peterborough line fixes a lot of the problem till you get to suburban Toronto, and then you're jammed to try to get to downtown. So, but to get to the other question of being the stations, fundamentally, we have to find ways that people don't feel abandoned by this project, but at the same time, we have to also look at the greater good and how we can combine the greater good with the local good. And that's the way that we're able to get the buy-in for this project. So it is exactly by building those partnerships with the local transit authorities to keep a relative level of service so that they don't feel totally abandoned and they don't turn against the project. But we have to build those relationships, and that means partnerships between federal and provincial and regional operators.
So what you're saying then is that basically for HFR to even work, GO and Metrolinks are going to have to build those lines that don't exist to Belleville and other places like that.
Well, it could be as simple as, for example, expanding a few trains or something like that. There are strategies that are there. The network is there. By Via Rail disappearing on the CN main tracks and whatever, we're going to be liberating capacity. We have to see this also at the same time as adding more capacity for freight. Let's not put our head in the sand. CN's not going to be sad of seeing Via Rail disappearing for the little revenue that they're getting. It's going to give them a lot more flexibility on their network, and it's going to give them a lot more potential traffic for their freight without them having to invest in their infrastructure. So in the end, everybody benefits if we do it correctly.
What about the timelines proposed? We've already seen a couple of delays in the early parts of the process. Do you think they're realistic? When do you foresee, if all goes on time from here on in, this operating and reaching a critical mass that it's got enough ridership to be viable?
Yeah. Well, I think there's certain segments that we can really get into high gear as soon as contracts are signed and get operational, including the Ottawa-Montreal now, because it's a line that I use, but it's Via Rail owned, almost no expropriations to get done. It's a short distance. We can do that. What's going to be difficult is going to be the western portion of the line, where there's going to be a lot of changes in the route. Even if we do buy the CP route, there's a lot of curves that are tight. We're looking at expropriations that are going to take many, many years. If you look in the U.S., expropriations have historically been absolutely horrendous on high-speed and high-frequency rail systems. And for me, that's the biggest hindrance on timeline for this project is going to be expropriation. I mean, we can build this thing in about 10 years. However, how long is it going to take for the courts for us to be allowed to bring our shovels and work on those properties that we need to get to?
Okay. Let me turn it over to our friends from the International Transit Workers Federation, just because they haven't had as much say, I don't think, in this discussion thus far, and ask the similar question in terms of the timelines that you've seen and read and heard about for this particular project, from your expertise in building these things. Are they realistic? What are the red flags? What are the causes for concern?
Thank you. So from what we've seen, this is a commonality of PPP projects where the timelines get more extended than originally thought. As the other speaker mentioned, the US is an example of very long delays on HSR and HFR. I think there's sometimes difference with Europe or with locations where there is a stronger control of state-led companies that have, as we discussed here, they have more control and more familiarity in dealing with other levels of governments and some of the private operators that are being proposed here. So I think from what we've been able to gather, this is going to be a further delayed project, and what can also come into play is the state of those private bidders that are bidding under certain conditions now. They're probably going to want to change how those bids were done in a few years down the line, and that's going to potentially delay the projects even more.
Thank you, Mr. DeBrusen, and thank you, Mr. Muse. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thanks, Chair. And I'll be sharing my time with my colleague, Ms. Katrakis, so we'll split the time here. First of all, welcome to the panelists. It's always great to hear from people with knowledge and expertise and providing the committee the benefit of your views and opinions on this particular project. Mr. Barrio, when government announced this bid, for 2 bids, I guess, one of the big key factors was one with speeds of 200 kilometers an hour and one that is referenced as high speed. And of course, the debate is ongoing about what it is we should be doing and why we should be doing it, whether it's for economic reasons, it's about moving people and goods, and timelines and these kinds of things. So, from your perspective, do you believe the higher speeds would be beneficial to this project, or are they critical to whether or not this project is a success?
High frequency rail is going to be competitive with the automobile. High-speed trains is going to be also competitive with the airplane. So it depends what is your final objective. I have a certain vision where I believe that Air Canada would abandon most flights that would be served by high-speed trains, that the trains would enter directly into the airports, that they would be code-shared, and I might even be able to get my Air Canada lounge benefits and even my Aeroplan points by using Via Rail. And if I'm out west, I'll be able to get my WestJet points when I'm using the Calgary to Edmonton line. That's the dream that I have. And that integration cannot be done with high-frequency rail. That integration can only be done with high-speed rail. So if we choose high-frequency rail but not high-speed rail, we won't be able to diminish significantly the air traffic in the triangle and in these short flights, which are those that, if we look in Europe, can be easily replaced by trains. So in this case, if you want to diminish airport congestion, and you remove a flight from Ottawa to Montreal, it's a shame, for the 14 people that are in that plane. But if I can replace that flight with a new flight direct to, I don't know, let's say Johannesburg, what is the better economic impact? Well, I think the better economic impact is to have a Montreal-Johannesburg flight than a Montreal to Ottawa flight at the airport.
Well, thank you very much for that perspective. I appreciate it. I'll turn my time over now, Mr. Chair, to my colleague.
Ms. Katrakis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Rogers, for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate asking a question. My question is to Mr. Barrio. and I'm putting on my hat as PS to the Minister of Tourism and Economic Development Agency of Canada for the Quebec regions. So I'm going to share with you two thoughts, my thoughts, and I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts are on my beliefs. So I believe that this project would essentially create a more competitive super metropolis out of 4 separate metro areas: Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, and perhaps Calgary and Edmonton, and the smaller cities in between, by making travel for work, education, business, tourism, or visiting family and friends much more efficient than anything we have today. I also believe that high-frequency rail is aligned with the government's direction to double tourism's contribution to our economy in a decade, and that once HFR is implemented, tourism will be boosted further, as domestic and international visitors will be able to seamlessly travel between the 6 great Canadian cities, including Banff and smaller centres, including Red Deer. You talked about Peterborough and Trois-Rivières. I'd be interested to hear from you from a socioeconomic and moving people between those cities. Is this something that you share?
I agree. Any improvement is going to be an improvement. That has to be clear. That has to be transparent. We have to look at tourism and the impact. And of course, trains are a major impact on tourism. We know because it's a question of accessibility. When we look at traffic around the world, people go to countries where there's trains. They'll travel much more to regions where there's trains than if they have no trains. That's a given. Regarding your concept of, bridging and creating these metropolitan areas and merging them together, that's exactly how Amtrak has been planning since the 1990s with the mega region concept. And via rail, yes, there's their tourist trains that are long distance, but we have to look at focusing on where the traffic is and where the demand is. And creating these mega regions is the way to go. And that's how, as metropolitan areas grow and grow and grow, they're becoming closer and closer together. And more people travel between the two. I used to fly between even Montreal and Toronto, and in the Porter flight, I always took the last flight out when I was teaching at York University, and over half of the people in the plane were always the same people every week. We knew each other, and these communities do exist, and this merging of a lot of workers does exist. So we have to set up that service if we want people to use it. If not, they'll use their car.
Merci, Madame Koutrakis. Merci.
Thank you, Madame Koutrakis and Mr. Barrio. Now we've got 2 minutes each for Mr. Basselou-Duval and Mr. Backrack. First of all, Mr. Basselou-Duval. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to turn to the people from Unifor, perhaps Mr. Kennedy. In a previous meeting of the committee, I put a question to a witness, namely, given the fact that 90% of Via Rail's income comes between Quebec City and Toronto trains, and we're going to create a new line operated privately, and no doubt it will endanger this 90%, and there will be a transfer of income. Via Rail hasn't just got that segment to cover, but all the rest of the territory in Quebec region, such as Gaspésie and Lac-Saint-Jean, Abitibi, and elsewhere in Canada. So what's going to happen financially to Via Rail if they're not the ones who run the northern part and they lose 90% of their revenue, which was basically helping to offset these other non-profitable sectors?
And thank you very much for raising that. That's a very valid point, and that's a major concern of Unifor's as well. Once we siphon off that money from the corridor, what's going to happen to the rest of Via Rail's operation around Canada, which we owe a form of connectivity to our citizens living in rural and urban parts of Canada that are not easily accessed. So what we see here in Manitoba, for example, is a very poor train service going up to Churchill. We only get a couple of trains a week, and we're secondary to freight. So what we've seen here is similar to the Greyhound story across Canada, which we've seen as a service that was very good at one time, that was diminished, and it doesn't exist anymore. And that's exactly our fear once we start siphoning extracting off the profits from the corridor, what's going to happen to the rest of the fleet? The fleet of vias right now is aging. It's poor. It's not really practical at all anymore, and it's not reliable. So it's a major concern of ours, and it's a very valid point that you raised, and one that we're behind very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Merci, Mr. Barcel-Duval. And finally, for today, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will pick up where my colleague left off, because Via Rail in the rest of Canada faces two major threats. One is the fact that HFR, if it's built along the current model, will remove 95% of Via Rail's revenue, and it's going to be tasked unreasonably with operating passenger rail in the rest of Canada along rural routes with only 5% of its current revenue. But the other major threat that VIA faces for its long-distance routes is the age of its rolling stock. And we've heard testimony at committee. Some of us have met with VIA's CEO, and the situation is quite dire because the government has put off the replacement of these trains built in the 1950s for far too long. And if we don't see the government commit to the replacement of that rolling stock in this spring's budget, we risk losing all of Via Rail's long-distance routes across Canada. And as someone who represents a riding in remote and rural British Columbia, that's not something that I'm going to stand by and allow to happen. So with your forbearance, Mr. Chair, I would like to move the motion that I have put on notice, and I'll just read it briefly, that the committee report to the House urging the government to commit in the 2024 budget to the replacement of Via Rail's long-distance fleet following an expedited timeline that allows for uninterrupted service. And I appreciate that we're near the end of the meeting, but I hope my colleagues will vote in support of this motion. Time is short, and we need to send a unified message to this government that we will not stand by and allow Via Rail passenger service in the rest of Canada outside the corridor to wither on the vine, and we cannot lose these vital services for rural communities. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you, and I hope we can get to a vote on this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Muse.
Yeah, I motion to adjourn.
Okay. Looking around the room, do we want to go to a recorded vote? Any opposition to adjourning?
Yes.
We do have an opposition, so I'll turn it over to the chair for a recorded vote.
We have a member missing. Mr. Baraway?
Oui.
Mr. Iacono?
We're voting on which one? Sorry. To adjourn?
The motion to adjourn.
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis? Miss Murray?
Great.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Strong? Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Dr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis? You're mute. Okay. Yes. Monsieur Barcel-Duval?
Non.
Mr. Bachrach?
No.
8 yeas, 2 nays.
Motion to adjourn carries. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses on behalf of all members. Wish you a nice rest of your day. This meeting stands adjourned.